Good day to all our viewers at this NWU and AMT's Agri Live Outlook webinar and conference with the theme Farmers, Markets and Consumers. My name is Pieter Moller. I'm from the Postgraduate Student Recruitment and Marketing Department of the Northwest University, and I will facilitate today's webinar and conference. With me, three very able and professional experts in their field, namely Professor Waldo Kriegel, Dr. Johnny van der Merwe and C.P. Crick. Now, the aim of today's webinar, in short, we all know what every single sector is going through in these times, and therefore I don't use the word tough times. Farmers, producers and people in the agri sector are used to tough times. So the coronavirus brought some challenging times to the sector, and we believe that we can make a difference and contribute for the greater cause. So we need to take notice of the challenges in the sector. How does the current situation influence us? And also, therefore, we have divided today's talk into three categories, namely farmers, producers, markets, and also consumers. If during the webinar you as a viewer or participant would like a certain topic to be discussed, remember to sign in on your YouTube account to be able to comment. And also to introduce now our panel of main speakers today, I would like to welcome the three speakers. It will be C.P. Crick and Professor Waldo Kriegel and Dr. Johnny van der Merwe. So I'll start off with Professor Waldo Kriegel. He is Professor in Economics at the NWU, where he teaches macro and microeconomics. And his research interests range widely from economic geography to social mobility. He also works with well-known Professor Raymond Parsons on the Business School's Policy Uncertainty Index. Welcome, Professor Waldo.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I briefly want to talk about the macro level challenges facing the South African economy broadly, and talk you through some slides that I've prepared for this. It's in the news everywhere. I think if you switch on the news this week, it's basically the coronavirus and the economy, and I want to speak to some of that. So SF, if we can move to my first slide there, there are many ways of thinking about what drives economic growth and what influences the economy. And one of the classics is to think about the components of aggregate spending, that the value of output is a function of consumer spending, business activity, the government spending and taxes, and of course exports and imports. So moving on to my second slide, I think you all agree that the South African economy was in trouble even before the corona pandemic hit us. This table over here is from National Treasury's budget documentation, and you can see that the estimates that they made for growth in the different components of total spending were already low. They were hoping for household spending to grow by 1.1% this year, government consumption by 1.6%, and fixed capital formation or investment hardly growing at all, and exports some growth, and then the pandemic hit us. And today the estimates that economists are putting out there are that it costs us 13 billion rands per day for the lockdown, and the economy is expected to shrink by between 5 and 7% in 2020. The Reserve Bank estimates 6.1 at the moment. So moving to the second slide, or the third one actually, looking at households or consumers, I think the package that the President announced last night is definitely going to go some way to support households to survive. But we cannot really expect that consumer spending is going to get the economy growing this year for different reasons. The high level of unemployment is a big one in there. Even before the crisis, unemployment was at a record high, at 29% by the narrow definition and much more by the broad definition. And now during the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown, people are losing income and they are also losing jobs. And all indicators show that consumer confidence is low and unsecured debt has been increasing. So I think on the consumer side, we can expect some recovery once we start phasing out the lockdown, but not a lot of growth propelling the economy forward. The next slide talks about business and investment. And the most recent data this week is from a survey by Statistics South Africa. They did a snap survey of around 700 firms, asking them how are they coping during the lockdown. And the graph, if you're able to make out some of the details, shows different sectors in the economy, where the blue bars on the left shows whether they were able to continue with their activities, and the yellow bars on the right-hand side shows those sectors that really closed down during this time. And you can see that there's a differential impact amongst different sectors. But the greatest part of the economy has been closed down now for almost 5 weeks. So the result is that these firms responded to the survey saying 30% of them can only survive a month without any turnover. And amongst those, 50% of the respondents said between 1 and 3 months is their limit. 28% said that they decreased their workforce's hours, and 19% reported laying off staff in the short run. And then half of them expect their workforce to stay the same once the lockdown's finished, but more than a third expect a decrease. Again, I think the assistance announced yesterday evening is going to help firms, but we're not in a position to say that firms are going to come back and really invest in this economy and get growth going in that sense. My second to last one briefly shows government spending. And we know from the budget end of February that the government's fiscal stance was already questioned as to its sustainability even before the crisis. And since then, there's increasing demands for spending. There's clearly less tax income when the economy grows slowly, and now the economy is shrinking. Yesterday evening, the president announced assistance of 500 billion rand. Now we can give that to the president. There was a fear that maybe this assistance package is going to be too small, but you can't accuse him of using a pea shooter in this case. He really got out the bazooka. And 500 billion is to the order of 10% of GDP. Now, we can speak more about this later, but the efficiency of spending and financing that spending are issues that economists are worried about at the moment. And my final slide is sort of just to say that what happens in the economy depends on more than just these components of aggregate spending. A lot of other things are also in play. And many of the problems that the economy had prior to the outbreak of the crisis and the lockdown are still unresolved. For example, economic infrastructure, the position of Eskom is something that we haven't read about much in the last few weeks, but that's, I suppose, as tenuous as ever. Issues like land reform or the implementation of the NHI are always out there and creates uncertainty for consumers, for investors, and that's not changed yet. On the side of the global economy, South African exports will only start doing much better once the global economy gets going again. So we're looking at the economies of China, Germany, the greater EU, and the US to see whether our export markets are restarting. Even if it becomes possible to physically export, that demand has to recover as well. So many different issues. I think I'll leave it there for the moment, but hopefully it provides some background to the discussion we're having this afternoon. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Balu. Very interesting. Our viewers, our next speaker will be Dr. Johnny van der Merwe. He teaches agricultural economics at Northwest University, with his reach focusing on agricultural development, sustainability, and also the competitiveness of supply chains in the agricultural industry. He is also Managing Director of AMT, providing market information and insights to various role players in the livestock, grain, as well as fresh produce industries of South Africa. Welcome, Dr. Johnny.
Thank you very much, Peter. Peter, I think, as Waldo also mentioned, we're in unprecedented times. We haven't seen this volatility in the food prices and in general in markets. And everybody is very uncertain. I think it's impacting on an investment. And you can see that in terms of the international markets, your local markets. And I think the lasting effect of this COVID-19 outbreak sometime into the future. And individuals and companies must brace for a difficult period that will be characterized by low economic growth, as Waldo also mentioned. The uncertainty and the low expected growth is a result of many active economic role players to go into survival mode, if you can call it that, looking to cut costs and protecting their core activities, of course. Unfortunately, this will mean that there will be many jobs lost and that South Africa's income per capita will take a severe beating. It's also clear from initial changes during the March-April lockdown that many supply chains are changing, with unnecessary role plays and activities eliminated from these supply chains. Um, this will be especially true if we look into the food supply chain, with many more people that will be at home, either if they've lost their work or restructuring of companies, trying to save costs, and let more people work from, and consumers that may start to think different about food and, of course, their consumption patterns. Low demand from consumers in general, I think if we can link that to Waldo's discussion as well, due to financial pressure, is expected to result in lower average prices and agricultural commodities over the next few years, which will affect consumption patterns, of course. I think there's some good news will, however, be especially for the agricultural sector, that demand will always be there. People must eat, and I think the way in which these supply chains function will be the main driver of success for companies and producers out there. I think the companies that's the most flexible is the ones that will be the most successful in approaching different supply chains, of course, and different LSM groups. I think the change in financial pressure and the change in economic conditions will have severe changes changes in demand for LSM groups specifically, and we have seen that not in the agricultural prices, of course. We have seen that different your luxury goods, if I can say it like that, were and demand shifting towards more necessary products, more health-related products, and but we can get into that at a later stage, of course. When we look into just a quick overview in terms of the fresh produce markets, we have seen that, and I think the livestock and grain markets, we have seen demand shifting before the lockdown, and that during the lockdown now we have seen a drop in demand, of course, and a definite drop in prices. For the livestock industry specifically, is that we're still currently above prices last year this time during the drought, of course. And these prices, and I think the drought made us ready for this pandemic, lower herd numbers and so forth, and lower numbers that's being sold, and the price drop that won't be necessarily that significant. We are expecting prices to remain on a downward trend, but yeah, I think that remains to be seen, and I think it's a big dependent on this. Be the demand from consumers out there that is definitely driving this price. So in short, to sum up my introduction, of course, I think the demand patterns will have a severe effect on markets and market prices going forward. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Dr. Johnny. And moving on to our third speaker, and that is our commercial farmer today, CP Creek, and he's going to explain to us how does it affect the farmer and the producer himself. CP is an industrial engineer with a passion for Africa, agriculture systems, and also people. Being a modern farmer and a commercial pork producer is the perfect fit for CP, where systems thinking and also industrial design is becoming part of daily life in agriculture. A few years ago, CP was Agri Gauteng's Young Farmer of the Year, and he has since been in a leading role throughout innovation also. He's a respected leader in organized agriculture throughout South Africa and also in the continent. Welcome to CP.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks and welcome to everybody tuning in today. Um, when you're part of the South African agriculture industry, you're part of something much bigger than just your farm and your family. In South Africa, a few important topics are discussed daily, and that includes food security, unemployment, poverty, public health, and our economy. As a farming business, you play a role in these factors to a varying degree, often behind the scenes and unknown to the rest of the world. In rural communities, agriculture has a direct, tangible effect on the economy and people who live there. It's important to understand the ripple effect of each decision you make in this integrated small communities. As a pork producer, we are very aware of biosecurity and the possible spreading and prevention of diseases in a country like South Africa. We've been dealing with foot and mouth disease and African swine fever for many years, to the point where we can effectively farm on registered compartmentalized farms and maintain export status without risking transmission of these diseases. We are also keenly aware of the health and social status of our employees and their families, as we work alongside them and share a common goal to have productive and protective farms, which in essence are providing all our livelihoods. And the health of our animals and our employees are very important to us, not only from a personal point of view, but also from a business point of view. And we understand what health and good health means, both for animals, but for our people as well, because we live with them and we live with them on a daily basis. And it's important to have these plans on the table, a health plan, before a crisis hits. Now, one event that really highlights all the above factors and bring everything together is a national crisis. Now, if you combine the crisis with a highly contagious disease, which will impact the most vulnerable and exposed people in your community, you suddenly realize as a farmer you've got a big role to play. We can continue operations and we can maintain a certain level of job security to our employees, but we still have an economic effect in our community. Farmers are caring by nature, and that's why we are stewards of the land we work. And already we are seeing a huge amount of support from farmers to their communities in terms of food supply, water infrastructure, and just by supporting their communities as best as we can. I strongly believe that South African farmers are not only versatile, but very resilient and able to adapt to a disruptive environment. We've been dealing with massive changes and disruptions over the last 3 decades, and yet we are able to continue producing and providing food security to not only our country, but to the world. One thing that South African farmers realized, not only South African, farmers as a whole and people as a whole during this pandemic realized, is that some of us might need urgent medical care, but all of us will need food every day. Then you realize being a farmer is not only about passion and feeding the nation, but also you're in a very sustainable business because food demand will continue. Currently, the supply and demand for products are very volatile and uncertain, and we are not completely geared to meet decentralized consumer demand. However, the overall demand for agri products will remain strong. I believe that. We know that. People will continue to need food and healthy food. We just need to distribute it correctly. Both supply and demand are strong, but the supply chain is not sufficient and adaptable enough to get the product to where it is needed at that point in time. Looking forward, I see that we will have a massive change to the global and national agricultural supply chains, with distribution channels changing, supply channels changing, and the way we distribute specifically. In times of instability, people want certainty and products they can trust. In coming months, I see that consumers will ask more questions about where their food comes from, how it was produced, is it safe and healthy to eat, who produced it, where it was produced. And these are answers that we as pork producers can already provide because we have very strict, very good quality assurance programs in place. And I think that's something that we need to roll out to the rest of the industry, both livestock and other produce as well. I see our economy will need to be much more self-sustainable, both locally and nationally. We need to look out for ourselves and make sure that every rand that flows into our community and into our country and onto our farm doesn't leave again. Smaller, well-established farmers can play a big role in the supply of the immediate community, and make sure that every rand that comes into the community is just turned around. And by that, we can develop the communities again. Farmers will play a big role there. We need to question the extensive transportation of raw materials and products across the country. The wastage of fresh produce must be limited. We need to develop a secure and trusted platform for direct sales to consumers. That's something to investigate, to make sure that we can connect farmers to consumers, but do it on a very well-managed platform. As commercial farmers, we will need to focus on efficiency in order to compete internationally. We are in a very good position to supply agri products across the world. And now is the time for the government to focus on opening those markets for us. I think one of the big challenges as farmers that we will face is how do we balance automation, mechanization, super efficiency on our farms with the social situation in our communities. We all understand where we are. We all understand what effect our decisions have, but we need to be very efficient and we need to be very profitable in order to maintain our communities and yet keep an eye on the social situation in which we operate. Peter, that's it from my side. I hope to engage with all of you and get some questions going. Thank you.
Thank you, Sepia. I think there's a lot of interest in the markets as well, and I'd like to direct this one to Dr. Johnny, but both of you are, the other two, welcome to add on. The question that was asked is, smaller fresh produce markets, are they still relevant as they are actually doing better currently?
Thanks, Peter. Peter, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think the way in which fresh produce markets operate definitely gives a relevance to these fresh produce markets, of course. It's based on the demand and supply, and I think it's the most theoretically economic driven price that is out there. So these markets, and we have seen that they actually have improved, or prices improved on these markets that's geographically located away from the major cities. It can be due to a more demand on that specific market, not necessarily supply factors. Supply could have played an issue, markets that is less accessible at the moment, but demand, people moving to their homes, to their traditional homes, and I think creating more demand for that, increasing prices. And you have seen that your bigger markets, prices definitely, looking specifically at fresh produce markets, prices definitely dipped due to a slack in demand the past couple of weeks after the lockdown, of course. I think the most important aspect that came out of the lockdown and after the lockdown, the first week of the lockdown, the informal traders, the hawkers and so forth weren't allowed to access the market. I think it was only retailers, bigger retailers with licenses and so forth. And we saw a big dip in demand and it was not necessarily for your high-end products, but the crucial role that they play in getting some of the, let's say, in the case of potatoes, your larger potatoes and so forth, getting that in your lower quality, getting those products away from the market and moving products away from the market, and of course supporting the price. And as soon as that stopped, we saw supplies actually piling up on the market, and the price dipping substantially. And when they were allowed back, we saw prices bouncing back a bit, but not really. What we have seen now, the last week or so, we have seen that retailers specifically, the demand from retailers dipped a bit, and that took a severe effect on some of the prices. Of course, we have seen that restaurants, takeaways, and so forth are closed, and that resulted in a lot of supply chain issues, basically. Supply chains that's closed at the moment, and all these supplies, all these volumes that need to go through one supply chain. So that's what I mentioned. I think there's going to be a definite shifting in the supply chains. But over the short term, it may bounce back if we look after the lockdown. I think when the restaurants open again, I think those supply chains may open up again. But we must be wary of the income, the spending, as Waldo call it, the spending that's driving the economy. So where are people going to spend their money, basically? And to my feeling, it's going to be less in terms of exports, your established economies, Europe, America, and so forth. The growth is going to be lower, and we will therefore see lower demand from them. And we export a lot of our products, basically looking to fresh produce to them. And those products can end up on our local markets and definitely impact our prices. But when we look into the medium term, we may see these supply chains moving back, restaurants opening again, and so forth, takeaways opening again. And we may see a supply change shift back towards that. So producers and distributors and so forth don't need to, I think, over the short term, need to make hasty decisions, which will cost them a lot of money to change their whole operating systems. I think my feeling is that they must rather look into what's the permanent changes going to be. How's the supply chains going to permanently change? If there's online, whatever, what's going to happen? But change your production system to accommodate that as well. And I think that will keep you sustainable over the long term. Thanks, Peter.
Johnny, you referred to supply chains, and I'd like to refer this and direct it to Sepia as a commercial farmer. The question that was asked now, online and also e-orders. It has increased with some even talking about orders straight from the farm. Will it increase in popularity, and what impact will this have on market prices according to your views?
Peter, if I can answer that one shortly, I think definitely we will see a shift towards more farm-to-fork trading, if you can call it that, and especially on e-platforms. It's not without its challenges, and that's why I also mentioned earlier that we need to establish a more, yes, there will be individual channels and where you can buy directly from the farm or from the farmer, but there might also be an opportunity for a centralized platform, because we as farmers are not always used to dealing directly with consumers, and farmers are a unique breed in a sense. We sometimes get better along with our animals than with other people. So farmers must also be careful before they just jump into e-commerce or direct sales, because there is a lot of things going with that. And once you start selling directly to the public, you need to look at a whole set of other health regulations and commercial and just regulations that you need to abide with. So definitely, I think it's opportunity for growth, also an opportunity to shorten the supply chain where you deliver from farm to consumer. But just be wary of everything that goes with that. And I think all the farmers need to decide at some point if they want to focus on primary production, if they want to go the extra mile and offer that service to their consumers, which we know there will be a demand for, but there's a reason why people also focus specifically on consumer sales from my side, Peter.
While we're with you, Sepia, a question coming in now. The negative effects of the foot and mouth disease followed up now with coronavirus. And a lot of you as commercial farmers depend on auctions to make a profit and to make a living. Any comments from your side?
Peter, yes, as pig farmers, we don't rely as much on auctions, and I think that's something we've learned in our industry, is that auctions can also be a cause of the spread of diseases. But traditionally, yes, it's a very good place to get a solid market value for your animals, and people are used to that. People also like going to auctions because they learn a lot there and they see a lot of animals at one time. Yes, foot and mouth disease did play a big role in the livestock industry, especially on beef and lamb. On the pork side, not that much, because we are the commercial farms are operating in the compartmentalized system, so we were protected from that. My personal opinion is that we should start moving away from auctions, because as a professional or commercial farmer, I think there is a premium to be paid for good animals and for quality animals, and there are enough people that are happy to pay you that premium, and who knows where those animals come from. Because once you go through the auction, you lose a lot of traceability. You can lose traceability in an auction setup. Whereas if you buy directly from a farmer, you maintain that biosecurity, you maintain that traceability link. And I think maybe something like foot and mouth disease must actually highlight the importance that we should start trading more directly and make sure we maintain traceability and get a good price for our animals. But yes, it did have a negative effect on us. Coronavirus had a negative effect on our demand because the supply chains were disrupted. Hospitality and catering facilities are not operating. A lot of pork go into those facilities, and we've got a slight oversupply of fresh pork in the market, and prices have gone down. Thank you, Peter. That's it.
Thank you, CP. We're coming back to the markets as well. Very interesting question. Thank you, Ruan. He asks, and I think I'm going to direct this to Professor Waldo. Waldo, what can graduates expect in terms of work availability for 2021? And I presume that he talks about agricultural students.
Thank you, Peter. I think economists need to be careful with their forecasts for 2020 and 2021. I think over the very short term, the disruption of the way that people work are going to slow people getting into new jobs. Just because HR is sitting at home and the normal processes are not running, I think that's already slowing down new opportunities. But as the economy sort of slowly starts getting going again, I think graduates are well placed to grab the opportunities that are out there. If you look at graduate employment and unemployment rates in South Africa, graduates do much better than almost any other level, unless you have postgraduate education. So in that sense, I don't think it's necessary to be more pessimistic following the coronavirus hit. The South African economy was growing very slow already before that, and with very slow levels of job creation. So keeping that in mind, the market is very competitive out there. And to my students, I would say, so put in every effort to be the best person at the table. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Waldo. I'm trying to run through a couple of questions. Johnny, I think this one directed to you. The current, or is there any correlation in what we experience currently in the agri sector in South Africa compared to farmers, commercial farmers, and also producers worldwide?
Thanks, Peter. Yes, definitely. I think everybody, if I specifically reference America or the USA now, they in a situation than we are currently, and they've seen a drastic drop in prices. So they definitely also seen a drop in demand, of course, and a massive shift or a disruption in their supply chain. Restaurants are also closed and so forth. And I think the main message that comes from the USA, from the international, the developed economies, is how are you gonna access supply chains, because people are still gonna eat. Sipe and Waldo mentioned that as well. People need to eat. I think the way in which they're gonna consume food is just gonna change, and that is basically what their opinion also is to say the way in which let's say you're gonna have more at home consumption, for instance. How is the potato, for instance, gonna look in terms of you're going to bake it at home, you're going to buy less takeaways and so forth. And those shifts in the supply chain is really, I think, impacting global food supply chains. I think the other major impact is, of course, people, the whole economy, the whole global economy will be under pressure for at least the next year. I know Waldo will know more about that, but they're think a rebound, hopefully in 2021 in terms of economic growth for major economies. But I think the dip in demand will have a severe or different effect on different commodities out there. For instance, let's say red meat, of course, your luxury goods, grapes, grape and grape products, wine, and so forth. I think is some of the factors that I've picked up specifically when talking to all the market agents. I'm talking to a lot of the RSA market agents. They really help me a lot, but they really have a good insight into where those markets are going and what's happening on the ground level, and different commodities is impacted differently. It's maybe a positive for the grain or the maize industry specifically. I think the LSM groups buying wheat, maize, meal will maybe increase for over the short term, but I think again it can depend on the spending of and where people are spending their money. And within certain groups, let's say red meat or beef, there's or beef products. There's, for instance, I think there's going to be less demand for steaks and I think a higher demand if you're going to do mince meat, for instance, more and people trying to cut costs. That's just my feeling. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Johnny. I'd like to run through another one and maybe to add on. Andries Fourie, thank you for that one. And I have to translate quickly. The importance of food security now. And his question is, the government as such now, are they aware of this pragmatic approach? Do they understand the need or the importance of food security at this stage? And you also spoke, Johnny, to people close to the government advisory board, what do you want to call them?
Yes, Peter, we've just before this live broadcast, we talked to Wandile Sishlobo. I think he gave us some insights into, he's one of the presidential advisors, of course, and he gave us some insights into how they're thinking about agriculture and the way to take it forward in terms of legislation and so forth. And he also gave some views on where he thinks things are going. And I think his views on where the agricultural economy is going will be much similar as the presidential board, of course, as he's on the advisory board, of course.
So let's have a look.
Slobo with us today. I know he's an advisor for the president himself, a renowned agricultural economist in the South African sector and the South African agricultural sector, doing great work. Thank you very much, Wandile, and thank you for sharing some thoughts for us today and taking some time to help us plan these really difficult times that's probably laying ahead.
Yeah, it's difficult times indeed, Johnny, ahead with the virus really still starting and a lot of unknowns ahead. But I think the South African agricultural sector has been in a relatively better position than the other sectors of the economy that are on complete lockdown. But obviously within the sector, we do have some subsectors like floriculture, wine industry and stuff that are not really trading. So the picture is mixed, but I think overall, when we look broadly, we are better than the other sectors of the economy.
Yes, and I think due to the essential nature of the agricultural food supply chain, of course, and I think that just exemplifies the important role, of course, that the agricultural sector plays towards economic growth. And I think everybody can see the importance now of it. Andile, from your side, what have you seen as being the major changes, and what do you expect going forward for this medium term, the short to medium term?
Yeah, I think the major changes have really largely been on a regulatory side. Like I said, the sector is still partially functioning relatively well, and obviously having played a crucial role in sustaining the livelihoods of South Africa, providing food security and all of those things. But I think in terms of performance, where we have changed our numbers, initially before the pandemic, we were thinking that South Africa's agricultural economy could grow by 15% on a year-on-year basis, having come from 2 years of contraction. This time around, though, because of the potential weak demand in the international market, we have revised down our growth forecast for the sector. We think that South Africa's agricultural economy could grow by 10% this year. This obviously is a good number, but when we look though broadly for South African economy on its own, I mean the economy of the country could contract by roughly 6% or even more than that, depending on how long the pandemic lasts and what interventions will be put in place and what's the pace of the unwinding the lockdown will pretty much look like. But these are really not the best of times. There are long-term changes, structural changes, obviously, that will follow this. And we think a lot of those will be on the labor market side, and it won't start in South Africa, but globally. We are seeing that in parts of Europe and also in North America. A number of farmers are struggling to get the farm workers because of the regulations that have been put in place on closing the borders and everything. And then the crops in some areas are rotting in the fields. We think that the big structural adjustments after this is going to be the increase in the automation or adoption of technology. So there's going to be a lot fundamentally that will change agriculture. But I think in the medium term, where we are looking at on our side is to say, how do you ease the areas that are still under lockdown in South Africa's agricultural economy? Once you put oxygen there, then obviously we see how the value chain functions going forward.
Yes, of course, and I believe it's a very fine balancing act and opening up the economy without doing more damage actually than spreading the virus more quickly. From a demand side, I know demand is driving the agricultural economy. It's driving the sector. Ultimately, from the consumer side, what do you expect from the consumer side in terms of and how that can relate back to agricultural commodity prices, of course?
Yeah, I mean, we think that on a demand side, given that you are dealing with the food sector here, where the demand is relatively inelastic, so we will be fine in as far as the local demand. But globally, that's where we worry about. And you will remember, Johnny, from your international trade numbers, that South Africa's agricultural economy, roughly around about 49% of our agricultural products in value terms are exported. So we are looking in Europe, we are looking in Asia, and we are worried about the dynamics of the consumer demand in there, particularly because we export in those regions some of our high value products, horticulture related and wine. So we worry that the demand could pretty much weaken a little bit in there. In part, it's the levels of incomes of people that are declining, but also the other factor is that the supply chains are also a bit disrupted, and that now is one of the other factors. But in the African continent is also the other market we are looking at, because you will remember, Johnny, that about 40% of our exports goes to Africa on average. So we are looking on the African market, and we worry that the levels of income are going down a lot. People are not going to have a strong purchasing power, and that could influence the demand for food products. The hope now that we are having is that if the World Food Programme, FAO, and all of the other international organizations could step in and be able to assist in terms of the food aid in African continent, and then South Africa would be in a position to do that. Now, if all of those assumptions hold, then commodity prices, yes, they will soften at levels that we are seeing. If you're thinking about maize, for example, it won't be at 3,000 or so. We could come down back to levels around about 2.2, 2.4 at those levels. But I think the African demand could sustain us. But I think within the next 2 months, prices will come down drastically from where the levels were sitting at. There are two commodities, though, Johnny, to add as I finish this point that I worry a lot about is the demand for red meat and also the demand for wine products. So that's where I'm really worried about, to say, will the consumer have the muscle to continue to demand a lot of those products in these tough economic times?
Yes, thank you, Wandile, and thank you for these valuable insights. I think definitely something to chew on, and some valuable insights, and I think for especially for our producers out there, for their production decisions and their strategic decisions going forward. I hope you have a good meeting later on, and yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Johnny.
Slobo with us today.
Thank you,
I know
Johnny.
he's
Thank
an
you
advisor
also
for the president
the
himself,
conversation there with
a
Lwandile.
renowned agricultural economist.
A lot of has
And
been said now about the retail trends, food chains, and I'd like to direct this one to you, Siep. Yeah, in the pork industry, you have advisors, you have people that's experts there.
Hi, Peter. Yes, thanks for the opportunity. Yes, we rely heavily on the retail to distribute our product. We have good relationships with several people in the retail industry, but also our processors and converters in between. And I think it's a good time now to maybe get some insight from Andrew Cox. He's from Enterprise Foods and one of the major players in our industry and also a big supporter of pork in the country. So Andrew is on the line. Andrew, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, my pleasure.
Andrew, can you maybe share with us a little bit of what you guys are seeing in the industry, in retail, specifically on pork and other meat, and then also other food stuff? We've got about 4 minutes, I think, to discuss that. If you can share your insight, please.
Perfect. CP, just to clarify the question, are we talking about current trends given the COVID crisis, or are we talking about sort of medium to longer term trends in retail?
I think briefly on the COVID crisis, Andrew, but then we want to know what's going to happen afterwards, 3 months ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so let me take it then slightly before the COVID crisis. So what we did see and what we have seen in the last number of years is quite a significant positive shift towards pork consumption throughout the channels. That would be retail, food service, and probably on the back of the fact that pork as a protein relative to chicken and relative to beef and lamb has become relatively good value for money from a consumer perspective. So obviously with chicken, with the reduced injection levels of chicken, and with that's obviously pushed the chicken prices up, and your beef and lamb prices over the last number of years have risen quite significantly. So pork as an alternative protein in the basket mix, we've certainly seen, specifically in the food service area, that there's been a lot of increased consumption coming into food service as well as retail. And you will find that where it's divided into processed meats, which is obviously your bacons, your hams, your polonies, etc., that area has probably been relatively static. The market has come back to the pre-listeriosis levels. That was the listeriosis crisis in 2018. So we've seen a sort of almost a full recovery of those volumes. But where we have seen volume shift to is fresh pork. So fresh pork in most of the retailers, in their fresh pork counters, we've seen quite a significant pickup in fresh pork counters, and that's because of the relative value for money that pork offers. So then moving into the COVID crisis with the lockdown, obviously two things have happened there. The first one being with food service effectively having shut down, we've seen that there's been a shift to in-home cooking and cook from start. So even your ready meals that were purchased in retail have moved more to basic essentials. And so certainly we're seeing in the retail sector a pickup in food consumption. So most of the food categories in retail are seeing growth in the short term, and that growth being driven by the closure effectively in the short term of the food service, out of home, restaurant, takeaway channels, etc., etc. And as I said, the other thing that is interesting is that it's moved to people who've got time at home, so they're cooking from start, from scratch. So certainly in the short term, a consumption increase. In terms of the longer term, once one gets out of it, obviously, and so what that has happened in the short term, there's been a slight glut of pork, because you would appreciate that with the food service channel having shut down overnight, there's a little bit of a lag effect before the food service side moves into the retail channel. So we are seeing a little bit of pork surpluses at the moment, and obviously that's on the open market trading. We're seeing pork prices having come off, and that'll probably increases given the lower prices on pork at the moment. Coming out of COVID, when we get out of lockdown, probably consumption perspective. So I guess consumption will balance, i.e. from retail back into food service. So you'll have a more balanced mix, as it were. But I think both sectors, longer term, are going to see competition for share of wallet from the consumer. So I'm not sure if that's answered it. Or
That definitely.
you want me to add?
Yeah, no, Andrew, that's perfect. Thank you. We appreciate your insights, and I'll definitely think there's going to be some questions and comments on that. Thanks, Andrew. We'll chat again. Peter?
Perfect. Thank you.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, gents. Another question, and we're running out of time, so I'd like to ask Prof. Waldo. Waldo, the current crisis, coming from Arno Kutse, the question, are we moving again to the times of the Great Depression? Will that result in the so-called credit bust?
I think the Great Depression has been mentioned frequently over the past few weeks. No one knows yet. I think one wise economist this week said that no models are available to predict the outcomes of this crisis, but that its size and scope is bigger than we've seen since the Great Depression. So I think if we look at the sort of packages that authorities across the world are putting on the table to get their economies going again, hopefully it won't be as big as the Great Depression. At this stage, it seems that a large part of the shock that the economies have taken has been on the demand side, which will sort of slowly dissipate as the different lockdowns phase out. Supply, we'll see once people return to office and return to factories, and hopefully get a slow but steady recovery following that. That's enough speculation. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Waldo. Another question, and this is a very interesting one, and I know the farmers will like this one as well, but Johnny, I'd like to direct it to you. Andre Groenewald asks, how will trust be created in the new digital way of doing agribusiness? And I mean, that is the one-to-one business that we got used to in the agriculture sector.
Thanks, Peter. Peter, yeah, I think we have seen a resistance in terms of online transactions and so forth. If it's due to the farmer or the producers that's getting a bit older, I think the average age of farmers is getting a bit older, and not adopting the new technologies. They like to have the things as they are used to it. And I think as soon as the new era basically will come in. For instance, now that we're doing the live conference, people will get more used to it. They'll learn to trust it more, and I think our banks and so forth are playing a major role in creating security online. And I think it'll be trust is created through the systems. And if they see online transactions is safe and so forth, then that will be created. I don't think there's a magic thing that anybody can say. I think it will be trial and error, and it will basically be due to security and people basically that can trust the systems to do their transactions and so forth. And yeah, but I think online, we still got a far way to go. I think the online consumer is still relatively small. I think it's your higher LSM groups. And we've got a wide variety of consumers out there, and I think the higher LSM groups, the online, it's a very small part of the business, and yeah, I think this will set us back. Some people, some new tricks, hopefully, but yeah, I'm not sure everybody's just gonna adopt it. And now, with that.
Thank you, Johnny. A very quick question to both you and to Sepia. Charles Orton asked the rand-dollar relationship, if I can call it that way. What will the effect be on the numbers of stock on farms? Would it have a negative effect?
Peter, from my side, in terms of piggeries, we can't really adjust our numbers very quickly. Yes, our input costs have gone up quite drastically. Maize, soya is very dollar and Chicago related. Additives to feeds, medication, etc. are higher, so our input costs are higher. We won't change numbers of animals. We can't. We're in it for a long run. We've got stable production. In terms of the rest, I think my personal view is that the farmers won't necessarily increase or decrease herds based on the rand-dollar exchange, but rather on what value they can get for the animals. And we've had a fairly good rain season, so they might rather keep animals back, keep them on the veld, than to sell them for a sub-par price.
Thank you, CP. Gents, we're running out of time. I'm going to give you 1 minute just to conclude. I'm starting off with you, Professor Waldo. Give us some positive news and something to work for.
I think on the positive side, we're heading towards the end of lockdown, and I think everybody's looking to the economy getting going again. And the president really announced amounts of money that is going to make a difference. There are questions about how efficiently that money is going to be spent and how sustainable the financing will be, but at least there's definitely a kick to get the economy going. So yes, we'll follow that closely. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Professor Waldo Kriegel. Moving back to you, CP Kriek.
Yes, Peter, I'm always the ever optimist, and I think as South Africans we've been through similar challenging times, and we've made it through there. And as an agri industry, we've shown that we are resilient, and that's my new buzzword, but we are. And yes, we will get through this, and things will change, and we will adapt, and we might come out much stronger. The agri business as a whole, agri industry, we are able to produce. We will keep on producing. There will be food on the shelves. No matter what happens, we will find a way to make sure we've got everything we need on the shelves. It might take a bit longer. We might need to adapt the supply chains. We might sell directly to the consumer or via smaller markets. But we will continue supplying, we'll continue producing, and we'll ensure food security for this country no matter what. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, CP. And just to conclude, Dr. Johnny van der Merwe.
Thanks, Peter. I think the good to eat, there'll always be demand. My thoughts on how to be sustainable, how to get through this crisis is basically, and I know CP will agree with this, is that there'll be a lot of volatility in your input costs and on your output costs, or your output prices, of course. And I think the factor that you need to keep an eye on is your profitability. And if you can do that, and you mentioned earlier about the exchange rate and how that will impact herd numbers, and I don't think it will necessarily, as CP said, impact that, because we may see lower commodity prices, but I think low inflation and so forth that everybody's expecting will result in, and of course nobody mentioned the oil price that they're actually giving away at the moment, and hopefully that will also help in terms of our input costs. And but the major factor that we need to keep an eye on is your competitiveness in terms of profitability. So even though you get less for your products, hopefully you must just manage your input costs, and you'll be sustainable out there. And just be flexible in your approach to the market. And hopefully this platform gave people some insights into what is possibly lying ahead for us over the coming few months or so. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Dr. Johnny. Yes, just to end off in a positive note, we believe, as I said in the beginning, that we can make a difference and contribute to a greater cause in the agriculture sector. The content of today's conference and webinar will be available on various social media platforms, but certainly most important of all, you'll be able to find it on NWU YouTube channel. So thanks to our speakers today, to Professor Waldo Kriegel, Dr. Johnny van der Merwe and CP Kriek. If you would be interested in any of today's information, or more importantly, if you would be interested in furthering your postgraduate studies at the Northwest University, don't hesitate to contact us. We thank you for your participating and viewing, and we hope and trust that you will stay safe. God bless.